Hello, Kristen.
Hi, Bill. How's it going?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Did you guys get a lot of snow up in Massachusetts this week?
Just a wee bit. You can still see the very tips of my picket fence.
Oh, nice. At least you know it's still there.
And I live on a street that gets plowed, which means the plows continually dump fresh snow onto my driveway, which is always extra special packed. So it's like, hauling boulders multiple times a day. So I'll be happy when this is all over. Well, while I was suffering the indignity of snow, there's some folks in Egypt having a bit more of a difficult time.
Yes. Although today in the Twitter sphere, the plight of the folks in Egypt was... Did you see this quote from Kenneth Cole? The tweet about the Egyptian... He said, "You want to know why people are rioting in streets in Cairo? Because they've seen our new spring collection." This happened yesterday. Everybody's like... What are you talking? Like, how to destroy your brand in one ridiculously dumb tweet.
You know what? I bet sales go up.
Oh, I don't think so. I mean, Kenneth Cole spent a lot of effort, I believe. I mean, every time I see their store, like in the mall, they've always got, they're not really political, but, definitely trying to make themselves seem like a,
socially
conscious company. Exactly.
Right.
So, I mean, in one single tweet, you can throw that all right out the window.
Now they're edgy and controversial.
I think there's a difference between edgy and controversial and just idiotic. I mean, there is, in fact, a line there, and I guarantee you I know which side this Kenneth Cole situation is on. But
Do you own any Kenneth Coles?
I don't know. I might. I know they have really good outlets. So I think I may have like a sweater or something.
I fully expect you to be burning your Kenneth Coles on the streets and protest.
I will.
But obviously, despite the government-mandated internet shutdown in Egypt, which I think is partially backed up, there still has been a lot of notable blogging and twittering, although some debate whether or not this is a blog-fueled protest or not. But both on the left and the right, there's been an analysis of what the right is doing in the course of all this. Are they continuing the Bush foreign policy of embracing democracy, or are they reverting back to more 80s style conservatism, national interest conservatism? Mubarak was our guy, and if it's not Mubarak, it's going to be something far less palatable, so we should be standing for Mubarak. Well, what's your sense of the conservative blogosphere these days?
I don't think there's really any consensus. You find everything varied from folks who think, we were friends with Mubarak for a long time and everything was fine. Well, I mean, this is not a. I read, like one post sort of sums it up. The best was from the American Spectator. It was Jay Homnick, who basically says, he outlines the history of, conflict in the region, conflict between Egypt and Israel, and says, which brings us to Mubarak. Since the assassination of Sadat, he has managed his country fairly well and managed the peace exceedingly well. The alliance between the United States and Egypt is by far the single most valuable asset we have bought in the entire world. Then in the next paragraph goes on to say, Egypt is not democratic with some repressive elements involved. Still, there are no Iraq meat grinders on the security front, nor are there leprous, gangrenous, scabrous, limbless orphans in tatters begging in the streets like Calcutta. Then skips down, we could have handled the situation by praising Hosni Mubarak's benevolent leadership while pointing out that it is in the interest of Egypt and its neighbors for greater democratic participation, much, in fact, as Condoleezza Rice did. However, mass anarchic demonstrations paralyzing the economy are counterproductive. And instead, Obama chose to say, the people are right, get out Mubarak now. Which is actually the opposite of what a lot of other conservative bloggers are saying in every possible way. You have other folks who've said that Obama has not really said enough, has been kind of weak. The best example of this was there was some criticism of the press conference that Robert Gibbs gave, where he said that first there's Ala Pundit, who has a video that says, Obama somehow manages to say nothing meaningful in Egypt statement, a post from February 1st, who basically says that it sounds silly for us as an American government who has backed Mubarak for 30 years, through administrations led by, this is a quote, through administrations led by both Republicans and Democrats, precisely because we knew he'd keep the fanatics among the Egyptian electorate out of power, to say the sorts of things like, he says, I have an unyielding belief that you will determine your own destiny. He says, if I were Egyptian, I'd feel grievously insulted that this guy would dare pay lip service to democracy and self-determination after his country looked the other way at fascism for more than a generation. Making the point that, it sort of rings hollow now for Obama to say, like, yes, we ought to get rid of Mubarak, people rise up and speak your mind, because we've been so supportive of this guy for so long that it sort of rings rather hollow. A lot of the frustration I've seen on the right has also circled around the way certain folks on the right, political leaders, specifically John McCain, have responded to this. You've got Dan Reel at Real Worldview, who's got a post up from Thursday saying, the title of the post is, I hope McCain's man diapers are more dependable than he is. I have a lot of really colorful posts today, by the way. I've noticed this, the tenor has been a little more interesting. Anyhow, the quote is, I see Ben Nelson is singing the same tune as McCain in regards to Mubarak. Meanwhile, there's a serious risk of the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamists playing games similar to the one that gave them Iran. What will this idiot McCain's next tune be, bomb Egypt instead of Iran, if it slides into extremism, in part due to the very nonsense he's spouting? And then Philip Klein at the American Spectator has a more objective take on it, where he pretty much just lays out, here's the difference between John McCain and someone else from the right, Senator Mark Kirk, where McCain is very, he's no fan of the Muslim Brotherhood. In this quote in the post, he says they're an organization with ties to terrorist organizations. They support Sharia law. That alone should be reason not to have them part of any democratic government. But the McCain point is that Mubarak needs to be gone. Democracy needs to happen. And he believes that the Muslim Brotherhood will not be extremist if they are a political force. Meanwhile, you have Mark Kirk, who says, quote, the French Revolution, Russian Revolution, and Iranian Revolution all had a plausible, acceptable interim figure that was immediately then swept away, and that's my fear. Far better that the Gamal Abdel Nasser secular nationalist tradition be what comes to the fore in Egypt. And then said, Egypt is a tough place to govern, so it probably needs a strong but new hand. So I think that divide between McCain and Kirk is a more appropriate, is kind of the best display of the division on the right, where you have some folks who think absolutely, more of the pro-democracy. We can't stop the Muslim. If people want the Muslim Brotherhood running their country, it's their country. We can't stop them. But better to have them have elections, have the Muslim Brotherhood try to position themselves as a viable political party. Maybe that will modernize them. Maybe that will moderate them. Maybe that will make them not bad. And then you have, on the other hand, conservatives who remain gravely concerned about the potential role that the Muslim Brotherhood would have in the absence of a strong secular leader like Mubarak.
Now, as the left looks at what's happening on the right and trying to find themes there, you see a number of folks on the left see the right trying to find excuses to blame Obama for what's going on there. You have Julian Rayfield at Talking Points Memo rounding up the various claims that Obama is in league with the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamist opposition party in Egypt. You have also Kevin Drum talking about how all the various criticisms of how Obama's handling it don't seem to then follow to what conservatives would do instead. Kevin Drum writes, as near as I can tell, conservatives are now obsessed by the Muslim Brotherhood and the possibility that it will gain power in Egypt. And in some vague way, they seem to blame the Obama administration for this possibility. At the same time, they're foursquare in favor of dumping Hosni and Mubarak and turning Egypt into a real democracy. And they vaguely blame the Obama administration for not being forthright about this as well. So what's the conservative plan? Does anyone know? Are we supposed to A, dump Mubarak, B, support democracy, but C, ensure the Muslim Brotherhood is kept on the sidelines? Who is the go-to conservative if I want to know what their plan is?
I don't think there is one go-to conservative as to what, and I think a lot of folks are concerned about the Muslim Brotherhood, but I don't know to what extent. I haven't seen any folks with a specific plan about this is what the constitutional reform should look like there that would prohibit, I think I mean, I think most of the frustration with Obama, I guess it's well summed up in this post from Ace of Spades. The poster's name is Drew M. And the quote is, I understand Obama is trying to engineer a soft landing here, and I actually supported that. But with regime-backed violence breaking out against pro-reform freedom forces, the U.S. simply cannot sit back and pretend to be even-handed, basically alleging that Obama ought to be more vocal in his support for the pro-democracy folks. It makes the case that, then the next quote is, Robert Gibbs gave his daily briefing today and it was a disaster. He was equivocal and vacillating throughout. I get that this is a complex situation and the administration was trying to walk a fine line on policy between public and private action. If you're going to do that, your communication strategy has to be spot on. In this case, it's been anything but. Gibbs was asked what the president thought of the images and clashes this morning. The answer was that he found them outrageous and deplorable, and he left it at that. If the president of the United States finds the actions of one of its main allies to be outrageous and deplorable, then some action has to follow. It hasn't. That's simply a failure of leadership. Also note the sequence of events. Mubarak gave his I'm staying until September speech, then he and Obama spoke for 30 minutes. Obama gives a statement saying the transition has to start now, and the next day the regime in Egypt unleashes violence on its people. What an amazing rebuke by Mubarak to the President of the United States of America. The ability of the U.S. to influence, let alone control events like these, are far more limited than we'd like to admit. So it's sort of, we can't force them to do anything, but if we don't have the ability to control anything. So, in one sense, it's sort of crazy for us to think that we could, as the United States, prevent the Muslim Brotherhood from getting involved here.
Before we get into the Muslim Brotherhood question, because we have some other posts about that, I just want to point out that on the left, there's also criticism of Obama not clear enough and specific enough. Coming from the left, and a wide range of folks on the left, for example, Marcy Wheeler at Fire Dog Lake, her own blog, There's Empty Wheel, her headline was, no one could have predicted the housing bubble crossed out, Middle East status quo would crash, to mock the whole notion that all these things are always blindsiding the so-called experts, and she focused in on a line, a Wall Street Journal article where it was reported that the National Security Council didn't have a contingency plan if the Mubarak regime did collapse, and she ends by saying, the self-declared smart people so sure they've got control over the situation are increasingly proving of late not to have that control. But I think Egypt must be a broader word in status quo everywhere, based on the Washington consensus economically and U.S. hegemony geopolitically, maybe a lot more fragile than experts paid to see that status quo will admit. Over on the more centrist side of the left ledger, Jonathan Chait at the New Republic headline, Obama is dropping the ball on Egypt. Based on the Robert Gibbs briefing today, the administration has not responded. Gibbs has alluded multiple times to private conversations the administration has had with Mubarak, but its public stance remains measured. Gibbs would not even acknowledge multiple reports that violence is being undertaken by pro-regime forces. It's unacceptable, and it has to change very quickly. You can't have an administration cautiously supporting a regime as it carries out a Tiananmen Square massacre. Now, a more nuanced take is from Mark Lynch, who has been known as Abu Aardvark. He had his own blog. Now he blogs at foreignpolicy.com, more sympathetic to how the administration has walked the line on this, but saying it's now time to shift. He said, I would say the time has come for the Obama administration to escalate to the next step of actively trying to push Mubarak out. They were right not to do so earlier. No matter how frustrated activists have been by his perceived hedging until yesterday and the violence that broke out, it was not time to move to the bottom line. Mubarak is an American ally of 30 years and need to be given the chance to respond appropriately. And everyone seems to forget that magical democracy words don't work. Obama saying Mubarak must go would not have made Mubarak go, absent the careful preparation of the ground so that the potential power brokers saw they really have had no choice. And I think that point, it's just interesting to me at least. I think it's hard to say who's right and who's wrong until the situation's actually played out and much more facts are known as far as what is said privately as well as publicly and what the results end up being. But there's definitely, I think, a bias in both the left and right blogosphere, particularly on these foreign policy questions, to demand specificity and clarity. And if you're not being clear, you must be being stupid or weak or vacillating. When there may be a strategic reason for being ambiguous when it comes to very sensitive foreign policy matters, and sometimes that ambiguity has merit, and you don't necessarily know who's right and who's wrong, because there's no cookie-cutter way to handle very volatile and fluid foreign policy crises. I don't think we know who's right and who's wrong until all the cards have been overturned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think the main theme of a lot of the criticism has just been that it seemed as though the administration got caught completely. They got caught without a plan. They got caught without, like, the common thread, I guess, would be you have this guy, he's 82 years old, you have what happened in Tunisia, like, you know, not like, sort of that couldn't you have seen this coming a little bit? And shouldn't we have long ago been thinking about what are we going to do? What does a post-Mubarak Egypt look like? And it's just seemed as though there was no thought. There was like a sort of fumbling of the ball, and what do we do? And then the realization, maybe this is going to lead to the rise of some folks, you know, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't, and, you know, what's the future look like? I think that's, most of the criticism hasn't necessarily been that Obama's done something grievously wrong, so much as he has not done a whole lot that has seemed very right.
Well, I mean, what he has said, I mean, I think there's, I don't sense a deer in the headlights posture of the administration here. Keep in mind now, I think Jimmy Carter is fairly in line with a lot of what happened with the Iran situation back in 1979, 1980. But I think it's fair to argue that there was more of a sense of blindsided might be the correct word. They were aware that things might go wrong, but they literally, when the Shah was overthrown, they did not even make a statement. They literally said nothing. So I think you could argue that they found their footing, even though it was very protracted and debilitating, and probably killed his presidency. The hostage crisis did end without serious bloodshed. So in that respect, if you read Gets the Ayatollah by Mark Bowden, he comes out in favor of Carter's overall handling of it. That's a digression. But my point is that when this happened, Obama did come out with a statement, and it had at least an ideological framework, which is that illegitimate leaders that have been rejected by sovereign peoples cannot stay, and that what should replace them must involve the breadth of opposition that's out there. I mean, he didn't specify, yes, the Muslim Brotherhood should be part of this, but there's an indication there that you can't take a very significant political party and arbitrarily remove them from the democratic process. I mean, that is a philosophy. When you have underlying philosophy, I think that does gird your foreign policy decisions going forward. You're not literally making it up on the fly. I mean, to some extent, there's going to be improvisation because it's a volatile situation, and you don't know what's going to happen on a minute-to-minute basis. But there seems to be an overarching philosophy here, at least.
Well, I think there's a post up on February 1st by Stephen Hayward over at Powerline, where he talks about a time when he was as a professor, he had a young Egyptian woman in his class, and they were talking about. Well, I'll just go straight to the quote. The nub of our classroom discussion turned to what I described as a dilemma facing American policymakers and Egyptian advocates of liberal democracy alike, namely that a free democratic election would follow the pattern of one person, one vote, once, as the Muslim Brotherhood or similar religious fundamentalists would almost certainly win, no amount of constitutional draftsmanship could prevent the disaster that would follow. So the dilemma is having to back a dictator like Mubarak or opening the door to something worse. No one likes these choices, but it's fatuous to think that we can make up a benign third choice out of whole cloth. So we go with Mubarak, cross our fingers, and hope for the best. My student, the young Egyptian woman, expressed an unsurprising dislike of Mubarak, but after a long pause said, I agree with you. I thought that it took some guts to say that in a classroom, where American students in particular resist the idea that sometimes the only choices in life are between bad and worse. But it also gave me hope that such maturity and seriousness exists for the best students from that troubled region. And then this wasn't like this semester. This was a student from a previous semester. But I thought that was an interesting, threw into relief that American students, he expected that they would not be so kindly accept the notion that there is only bad and worse as possible options, that we always like, that we as Americans like to think that democracy is a great thing and it can solve lots of things. And it's sort of going to be tough for President Obama to square that very American sentiment, that belief that democracy is wonderful, with the unfortunate realities of the consequences of democracy in other parts of the world when it might not yield sunshine.
I think most folks would agree that democracy is not a panacea to everything. But again, there is a foreign policy philosophy that appears that the administration largely subscribes to, which seems to be different than the way the Bush administration handled democracy. That's supposed to be what they talked about. I mean, when the Palestinian elections happened, the Bush administration initially said, we're going to have elections in Palestine, and that's great. And then when Hamas won, they said, we didn't want you guys to win, no money for you. And that made the administration look very hypocritical when it came to democracy. What the Obama administration seems to be saying, and again, I don't want to put words in their mouth. We don't know what's going to happen in Egypt yet and what their reaction is going to be. But they seem to be saying that if everyone is represented here, I mean, and the theory behind this is even if you take something like the Muslim Brotherhood, and there's a great debate whether if they have ties to terrorism or not. I think most of the experts would say they don't have direct ties to terrorism at this point, even though they're an Islamist party. That having folks like that, once they get into the power structure, can moderate their behavior. And I think there actually was evidence of this when Hamas won. Under Bush, there were indications that not the international Hamas based in Syria, but the Hamas folks that were elected were making outreaches. We're saying, hey, we'd like to stay here, and we'd like to keep the Palestinian Authority funding, and we're not going to go unleash a whole bunch of suicide bombers if you take us seriously. So there was at least some initial evidence that theory might have played out to our benefit. We won't know for sure because that's not how the Bush administration responded to that outreach. So there's a theory here of how you handle democracy that you don't, and this speaks to an argument of having some strategic ambiguity here. You don't want to just have America side with somebody and perhaps then taint them in the eyes of the local people, because America then being seen as the puppet master, as opposed to saying we side with the people in general. We're not picking our favorite parties. We'll talk to all sides. We'll engage with all comers, and you guys decide who your leadership is, and that might lead to a better relationship down the road. There may be a chance for that theory to be put into practice.
Well, I actually have a post that sort of relates to that idea about Americans not wanting to be seen as the puppet masters. Claire Berlinski over at Ricochet, who is someone that later, I guess, sort of the next big conversation she plays a very large part in, but so she is based in Turkey and sort of went out on the streets. I found out on Twitter today that a protest was scheduled for 3:00 p.m. on Istanbul's Taksim Square in support of the protesters in Tahrir Square. Curious to know what Turks are saying about these events. I pitched up dutifully to put to the fact that not one person showed up in context. I should note that Istanbul is a city of some 15 million people. I see protests all the time in Taksim, and I know for sure that Turks really can get their freak on when they feel like something's worth protesting. So she asked people, why, if we were all supposed to be here protesting in solidarity with the folks in Egypt, why did nobody show up? And she said, I spoke a bit with people. Wasn't it odd I asked that Turks weren't protesting the brutal crackdown on Egyptian protesters? Turks are madly on the side of oppressed Arabs, right? And then she said, well, yes, they agreed, but the sentiment among Turks, one guy suggested, was there was something really fishy about those Egyptian protests. Arabs couldn't organize their way out of a paper bag, so it must be the Americans behind it. So I can see that.
Think how much worse that attitude would be if America was literally explicitly embracing them.
But I do think it's almost, it's sort of bizarre the extent to which the Mubarak regime is now sort of, flipping the proverbial bird to America. They're beating up Anderson Cooper. He's a national treasure. I think, to the extent that, I certainly think it would be unproductive for it to look like the United States was dramatically meddling in any sort of situation in the Middle East. But I think that the fact that that Mubarak thinks it's okay that he can support quietly the pro-Mubarak protesters, and the sort of violence that they've unleashed upon people is kind of ridiculous and makes me concerned that perhaps, whatever Obama said to Mubarak obviously did not convince him not to pursue that sort of path.
Well, just to get back to this question about the Muslim Brotherhood, and before we move on to some non-Egyptian topics, there's definitely some debate on the right whether or not we should be accepting of the Muslim Brotherhood being part of
a transitional government or part of the democratic process going forward. There was a interesting post by Juan Cole, who made his name in the blogosphere. He's a professor at University of Michigan with very trenchant coverage of what's going on in Iraq. Has a post why Egypt 2011 is not Iran 1979. How the Muslim Brotherhood is not like the Ayatollahs of Iran, and more broadly speaking, there isn't even as deep a dissident clergy community in Egypt or exiled out of Egypt the way there was in Iran, and the secular class in Egypt is much stronger, and therefore it wouldn't be right to presume that the situations are parallel. Because what happened in Iran, folks don't know. I mean, it wasn't a literal Islamic revolution at its beginning. It began in a sort of a similar way with an eclectic coalition of groups. It was only after a caretaker government was formed that the Ayatollahs then swooped in and kind of hijacked the whole thing. So in theory, there's some parallels, but Juan Cole's arguing that if you look a little bit deeper into the surface, there's a lot of forces at play that are not parallel and should not be presumed that this would. In fact, he even made the argument that the Muslim Brothers' popularity would weaken because part of its popularity is based on being the not Mubarak. And so they're being said the only alternative in town. Now there'll be other alternatives, and they may actually lose followers once Mubarak leaves. But you've noted to me an interesting exchange between Conor Friesdorf and a couple other conservative bloggers on this question.
Yes, so this sort of got started off by some posts over at National Review's The Corner, particularly a post by Andrew McCarthy entitled "Hamas is the Muslim Brotherhood," and says, Hamas's overt intervention in Egypt, it references someone who posted about Hamas intervening in Egypt. It says, it's worth pointing out that Hamas is not merely colluding with the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas is the Muslim Brotherhood. That, of course, is not what you will hear from our foreign policy experts such as Obama advisor Bruce Riedel, who's busy sculpting their narrative about how the Brotherhood, the font of modern jihadist terror, has renounced violence and is really nothing for us to be very concerned about. But the stubborn fact is that Hamas is the most prominent of the Brotherhood's Palestinian branches, whose operations long predated Hamas and brought Hamas, a.k.a. the Islamic resistance movement, into being. And then he quotes some sections from Hamas's 1988 charter that clearly say the Islamic resistance movement is one of the wings of the Muslim Brothers of Palestine. The Muslim Brotherhood movement is a world organization, the largest Islamic movement in the modern era. And at the end says, note that Hamas's slogan is indistinguishable from the Brotherhood's. Allah is our objective, the Prophet is our leader, Quran is our law, Jihad is our way, dying in the way of Allah is our highest hope, Allahu Akbar. So then Conor Friedersdorf, and let me preface this by saying, I have positioned this as a fight within the right over how important the the Muslim Brotherhood is, or not how important, but to what extent they are connected to Hamas. But I do not think that Conor Friedersdorf would want me to tag him as a blogger of the right, and I do not know if the right would want me to tag Conor Friedersdorf as a blogger of the right. So let me be perfectly clear about that.
At least he's right-leaning.
Yes, I would put him certainly more in the conservative camp than anywhere else, but certainly with some distance. At any rate, so then over on the Daily Dish, he writes a post, Sophistry and Defining the Muslim Brotherhood, where he takes a quote from Andrew McCarthy's, he did an interview where he basically asserted the same thing. And Friedersdorf's response is, see the trick? The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is itself an entity with moderate and radical factions. But here McCarthy treats it as an organization that can be spoken about coherently as a whole. Okay, fair enough. So there's the Muslim Brotherhood, and then there's this different entity, Hamas. There's a relationship between them. But delving into it would be too subtle for McCarthy. And he knows that Hamas carries strong negative associations among people who have never heard of the Muslim Brotherhood. So he just conflates the two in a clever little talking point he's constructed. Hamas is the Muslim Brotherhood. Well, no, they're actually different. Yes, Hamas was founded as an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood back in 1987, and Slate was founded as an offshoot of Microsoft in 1996. Now imagine someone coming along and saying, Slate is Microsoft. You'd understand the flawed logic. And then later goes on, and in a point that I find particularly insulting as a reader of Mr. McCarthy's work, unfortunately, Mr. McCarthy is dealing with readers understandably ignorant of Middle Eastern history over the last 2 decades ago. And he has a talking point he wants to advance. So rather than grappling with a complicated reality in a way that makes him worthy of his readers' trust, he makes a ludicrously simplistic assertion, offers arguments for his truth that treats decades-old rhetorical assertions as if they trump real-world actions. which is more than a little insulting to people who read National Review, I think. Not the most diplomatic.
Seemingly intended to be as such.
Yeah. To which Claire Berlinski, who I will admit I adore her writing frequently, she then says, responds with the post entitled, "Yes, Hamas is the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood." Connor Friedersdorf, I don't know what your problem is with Andy McCarthy, but you've got better things to do with your time on a day like this than to denounce his sophistry about the Muslim Brotherhood. Then cites a paragraph that she deems particularly time-wasting and says, Connor, you've directed your readers to me. One of the links at the end of Connor Friedersdorf's post, he says, you should go read from this person, Claire Berlinski being one of them, if you want a better insight on the connection between Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. So she follows up, Connor, you've directed your readers to me, and I've consistently said just what Andy McCarthy says about the Muslim Brotherhood. Here's my higher quality argument, Dish readers. Andy's right. You've also directed them to Eli Lake at minute 4, and she she links to a video where she says at 4 minutes 53 seconds, Eli makes precisely the point you're denouncing as simplistic, namely that Hamas is the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood. In other words, and then, so then he responds with an extremely long post where for many, many, many paragraphs, he basically goes on and says, this is why I don't like Andrew McCarthy. And then ends with, for our purposes, it's enough to know that there are some people who think they're wildly dangerous and should never be dealt with or trusted. Other people who think they can definitely be engaged or influenced politically. I prefer a mix of folks who aren't sure and take some middle ground. I don't have a dog in this fight, or if you prefer, I'm in the group that is uncertain and open to arguments from either extreme. Mr. McCarthy and Mr. Berlinski share a belief that the Muslim Brotherhood is tremendously dangerous, and then goes on to try to make the case that Claire Berlinski has not actually previously written that Hamas is the Muslim Brotherhood, whereas I've read plenty of things where she's not a huge fan of the Muslim Brotherhood at all.
Is Connor arguing that it's not that Andy's final point is necessarily wrong? He's professing himself to be uncertain, but just that Claire is arguing it in a far more tighter way than the sloppy way Andy McCarthy is doing it? Is that Connor's point?
Well, I think his point is more that he just does not view Andy McCarthy as someone who makes serious arguments about this broadly. I mean, he gives multiple points about issue 1, issue 2, issue 3, issue 4, issue 5, all about sort of Mr. McCarthy asserts that President Obama is leading a grand jihad against America, wherein the hard left and radical Islamists form an alliance against this country, as he tells Catherine Jean Lopez. And he goes on and gives a quote where he basically says that Obama and the Muslim Brotherhood are buddy-buddy, a little more than we ought to be comfortable with. And so that's a point in which he says, Connor says, well, in contrast, I think that President Obama's foremost loyalty is to the United States, and that rather than aligning himself with Islamists, he's prosecuted 2 declared wars and various undeclared drone wars and special operations against the Taliban. Basically saying, like, one of the reasons why I don't like Andrew McCarthy's points about the Muslim Brotherhood is because I am distrustful of his intentions and think that he thinks that Obama is an Islamic terrorist, whereas I think Obama is a patriot, and so believe me, not him. Which may sound like a sort of sarcastic way of framing this, but I think that in particular his point, like, well, Slate came out of Microsoft and Slate's not Microsoft, is like a really that's sort of an intellectually lazy argument there. I mean, plenty of things are, Joey was a spin-off of Friends. I mean, like, there are any number of things I could point to as like, I think that kind of argument is really weak when the two organizations are Islamist political organizations that within their countries, that within their countries, regions, they both served very similar roles in that the secular governments that sort of had been neglecting, personal freedoms, humanitarian needs. I mean, students in Palestine were educated in Hamas schools. The Muslim Brotherhood also has played a role in sort of community building type things in Egypt. So, I mean, I think there's plenty of arguments to be made, not only that they are similar, but that they are, in fact, an extension of one another, and that point is valid and worthwhile rather than this Microsoft Slate point.
Perhaps we'll leave that debate there, shift on to some of the other non-Egyptian stories drawing attention in the blogosphere this week. Interestingly, the fight over abortion is resurfacing in a couple different ways this week.
On the left, you had Nick Bauman at Mother Jones flag, I believe the first one to flag, in the language of I believe the bill next coming up in the House, the No Taxpayer Funding for Abortion Act, which is primarily intended to expand the current ban on federal funds for most abortions to apply broadly to the new health reform law, to the extent where even the private insurance will essentially be unable to provide abortion coverage, even though it would not be direct federal funding going to it. This was the contentious point when the bill was first passed, and a compromise was formed that didn't make any of the anti-abortion or pro-choice communities happy, but it passed, and this act was intended to try to essentially unravel that. But what Nick Bauman found in his reading of the text of the legislation was that it was going to redefine the rape exception. There was already an exception in the Hyde Amendment, not originally, but added later, to say federal funds could be used for abortions in cases of rape and incest. And this new bill was going to define rape as forcible rape, which Bauman interpreted as could be narrowing the definition, so it would not include situations where there wasn't physical force used. If someone was drugged, for example, or if there was a case of statutory rape of a girl that was 13. Interestingly, a lot of times these types of stories, I think, originate from the right more than the left, digging up this nugget of information that had been overlooked by the traditional media, thrusting it into the discourse and putting the other side on their heels. But this kind of came from the left. It got a lot of other blog pickup.
Bill, I just lost you.
Oh, you lost me? Can you hear me now?
Oh, yeah, I can hear you now. Sorry. No, I heard you up until the right sometimes finds these nuggets and then it sort of like faded out.
Okay, that's
Sorry.
okay. Why don't I just speak again in case the good folks of blog want to splice?
Okay.
A lot of times the right are the ones that find these nuggets of information that are buried in the text of a bill or regulation and blow them up, and they become.
We like to read the bills, Bill.
And you're good at it. I'll give you credit there. And make them into larger scandals and put the other side on the defensive. I don't see the left doing that nearly as effectively or as regularly, but here's a case where the left did, and I got a lot of other blog pickup, a searing segment on The Daily Show Wednesday night about it, and as of today, my understanding is, when I saw in Huffington Post, that the Republicans are backing down and are going to take that language out of the bill and make sure that the language is more identical to the current standing Hyde Amendment. Now, this doesn't negate the whole other issue of the primary purpose of the bill, to unravel the healthcare compromise. But it is an example that the left still has some means with their online platforms to put the right on their heels.
Yes, well, I actually first came across this issue at a post at Jezebel. And clearly I was a little sort of stunned that, at first because the post implied that, the definition of rape itself was being changed so that it would require force. And then I read the sort of what I would consider to be the best conservative response to this from Catherine Jean Lopez, who says, in recent days, the left has pumped up the volume with scare tactics about the new majority in the House of Representatives. It says the latest attempt at scaring and misleading the public is the recent claim that Republicans, in some kind of supposedly radical ban on federal taxpayer funding of abortion, a ban along the lines of what the pro-choice left has claimed has been law all along, is trying to redefine rape. Redefining rape, they're not. In particular, they're taking aim at H.R. 3, the No Funding for Abortion Act, which everyone from John Boehner to Republican Study Committee Jim Jordan to Democrat Dan Lipinski has explicitly and vocally supported for about a year now. Also on their radar is the Protect Life Act. Then she references the Mother Jones piece and insists that Republicans are on some kind of rape campaign that, quote, rape is only really rape if it involves force, so says the new House Republican majority as it aims to change the abortion law. But then she points out that forcible rape is it is a term. It's not saying that, in the case of an unconscious woman or something like that, that they're not counted. She actually speaks to Douglas Johnson of the National Right to Life Committee, who his quote is, in our view on this matter, The bills would codify the substance of the policy that was in place from 1993 on, which rape incest exceptions were added to the Hyde Amendment. We do not believe that the Hyde Amendment has ever been construed to allow federal funding of abortion based merely on the youth of the mother, nor are we aware of evidence that federal funding of abortion in such cases has ever been practiced. It is true that the new bills would not allow federal funding of abortion on all underage pregnant girls, but this is no change in policy. In falsely claiming that it is a change in policy, the pro-abortion advocacy groups are engaged in a brazen effort to greatly expand federal funding for abortion. So that's the quote from the National Right to Life Council. But I think that the point that she makes the best is that you can read the FBI's own longstanding definition of forcible rape, which when you pull it up, it doesn't say that forcible rape doesn't count if it says forcible rape as defined by the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting Unit is the carnal knowledge of a female forcibly and against her will. Attempts or assaults to commit rape by force or threat of force are also included. However, statutory rape without force and other sex offenses are excluded. So it's not sort of she was trying to say it's not redefining it. It's basically saying it's everything except statutory rape. If the woman is younger and it is forcible, then that's still rape. But if it's a case of a 15-year-old and a 19-year-old boyfriend, or what have you, that is not grounds for providing abortion coverage. So that was sort of her response that the Mother Jones article blew way out of proportion what this language would have actually done. And so that's why I think, because now House Republicans have gone back to just Hyde Amendment language, I think that's smart of Republicans to do, but I do think that Catherine Slope, I think that her point was pretty well made, that it was scare tactics largely, but obviously effective because it's changed the legislation.
But is she acknowledging at least that there was a deliberate attempt to change the definition so it would then include statutory rape as being ineligible for federal funds?
Well, her point here is that statutory that women who basically the point is that this wouldn't actually be a change. That the whole point here is that's why she uses that quote that says that the definition has always excluded statutory rape, and that they are not aware of evidence that federal funding of abortion in cases of statutory rape has ever been the practice. That could be wrong.
Yeah, I'm not positioning myself as an expert on the subject, at the very least, that you're taking current language and changing it. The term forcible rape is not what was used in the Hyde Amendment in the first place. So when you're changing it, at minimum, you're raising the question, could this be interpreted differently by the courts? And the National Right to Life is not going to be the final arbiter of how it gets interpreted. It's going to be judges who interpret the law. And it may well have been that if it passed as is, that the judges were interpreted as being no change, but you wouldn't know that going in. And it raises the question, why is it that the initial drafters of the bill went out of their way to add in a word that wasn't in the current law in the first place? If they have an agenda to narrow this definition in some way, because there is obviously a school of thought among some anti-abortion advocates that there shouldn't be any exceptions whatsoever, and so there'd be an incentive there to try to narrow as much as possible and try to do it on the sly. Or it could have just been sloppy bill writing, and people said, I didn't really want to get into this whole issue about the definition of rape. I just wanted to unravel the compromise from the health reform law.
Yeah, and I don't know what the motivations of the folks writing the bill were, except to say that there is definitely an argument on the right that in the case of statutory rape itself, it doesn't necessarily, that statutory rape, that it is in fact very, it's different from forcible rape. And so to the extent that they would prefer for federal funding for no abortions, but understand that we do need to offer it in certain cases, that in the case of statutory rape, I think it was another quote from the national, I want to make sure I get here we go. This is the quote from the same gentleman in the Post. It says, "They want to federally fund the abortion of tens of thousands of healthy babies of healthy moms based solely on the age of their mothers." And so that's the argument for why you should exclude statutory rape. The only point that I think that I wish to make in this case is that I was very disheartened about Republicans when I read, when I first saw the Post on Jezebel and thought, oh my gosh, what are they thinking? And then to now find out that really was overblown. It was not as though the bill had a special line item that said, oh, if you were drugged and unconscious and didn't fight back, too bad, you're losing your funding. That is a blatant misrepresentation of what was going on with this language. And while I think that the original Hyde Amendment language, fine, let's go back to that. You know, I'm not like advocating that they keep the forcible rape language in, but I do think that the way this got spun, that I saw from the lefty, the world of the left, was that it was spun to be this really scary thing that you know, that short of a woman punching her attacker back, she was going to be disqualified from federal funding, and that's not the case.
Speaking of wild distortions, there was...
Oh, ooh, what's next?
There was another video sting coming from the right, infiltrating the offices of Planned Parenthood offices. And as the result of this, one worker for Planned Parenthood was fired by Planned Parenthood. But Planned Parenthood has made the point of saying that, you know, we smelled this as a hoax a mile away, and we alerted the FBI to it a week ago. And as Ned Reznikoff at Media Matters said, Andrew Breitbart and his lackeys are crowing over the Planned Parenthood's firing of Amy Woodruff because it proves, well, I'm not exactly sure what it proves. They don't condone her behavior. I don't think this quite get why we called the video a hoax. So once more, Woodruff said what she said. That's in the video, and those are her words. The hoax part comes when the conservative Ms. Rose insists that someone demonstrates a systematic pattern of abuse and corruption pervading all of Planned Parenthood. The organization reported suspected sex trafficking weeks ago. They fired Woodruff. What other actions would Andrew Breitbart, James O'Keefe, and Ms. Rose have them take? So I take it the folks on the right are not applauding Planned Parenthood's actions in the wake of this video.
No, obviously not. I mean, Planned Parenthood's never been beloved by the right. But, in her post at Big Government, Lila Rose writes, this is with the release on the Thursday release of the sort of second clip of another instance of this happening. This one, it was in Virginia, I believe, this second one. Our investigative team has just released the second undercover video revealing Planned Parenthood counseling a pimp on how to obtain secret abortions for his underage sex slaves by bypassing Virginia parental consent laws meant to protect children. And then goes on to see it for yourself. From 2007 to 2009, we released 10 cases of sexual abuse cover-up in 6 states, and our footage has led to suspensions, firings, resignations, numerous state investigations, and probation. Institutionally, Planned Parenthood refuses to report the sexual abuse of minors, even if the law requires that they do so, and even if the abuse is as brutal as sex trafficking. And I think it's because in this new video, apparently the quote is something of the effect like, we do this all the time, or like, oh yeah, we get a few of these a month, and we know how to get the judicial, run around for it. I'm trying to find the exact quote because I don't like just making these things up. Let's see. So basically, in summary, Ed Morrissey at Hot Air says, he goes through the transcript and then at the end notes that the only legal issue raised in the whole interview, where he talks, where they bring up that these women are very underage, and he mentions the one question that comes back is the Planned Parenthood woman says, are they legally here? Are they legal residents? He says, believe it or not, the only issue raised in this interview, the immigration status of the girls prostituting for the pimp. He had already stated that some of the girls were 14 to 15 years of age, which constitutes criminal sexual exploitation of minors. That requires abortion clinics and all medical facilities to report the information. But then he goes on and updates and says, yes, as we noted in an earlier tape, the National Office notified the Department of Justice when it discovered that a couple claiming to be a pimp and a prostitute had visited a number of clinics asking about Planned Parenthood operations. But in the first tape, the manager enthusiastically advised the pair how to avoid legal detection, and in this one, the nurse didn't seem concerned about it. And if she didn't notify local law enforcement immediately, then the clinic almost certainly violated the reporting law themselves. That in these interviews, it's sort of the tone of the people not being very concerned about it that is kind of damning. This is doing the ACORN thing all over again to expose what they believe is an organization that does not operate in the way that it claims to operate, that in the day-to-day when confronted with a situation like this, that there would be sort of secret end-arounds of laws that they don't like, and that if an organization is accepting taxpayer dollars, that shouldn't be going on.
Except they're taking essentially a sliver of data. They're not doing...
Oh, yes. As a statistician, I will this was not a survey. They did not go into every Planned Parenthood clinic and check. But but to the extent that many on the right wonder why there's federal funding for Planned Parenthood in the first place, there was a bill, or there was a post by Jennifer at the blog Kubachi who says, time to fast track Pence's bill to deny federal funding to Planned Parenthood, that now that this is out there, that now sort of is the political time to cut the $363 million in government revenue that goes to Planned Parenthood.
Well, I mean, let's just understand what they're doing here, because these folks are trying to present themselves as, and I believe Guy Benson said this at Town Hall, these folks are investigative journalists. But this is not the practice of journalism. Journalism would not just do the one cheap stunt, or at least these traditional journalism wouldn't do the one cheap stunt and then not do any additional reporting about, okay, what happens throughout the rest of the Planned Parenthood apparatus? Does this one individual case that we came upon with actually reflect something systematic, or is it just one bad apple? Planned Parenthood's actions in the wake of this would indicate that's not systematic. Certainly you can't take the basis of this one video and say this proves that the whole system is rotten, unless of course you're not really a journalist and you're an activist, and that's what you're trying to communicate a talking point. But that's what this tactic is all about. Well, the other thing, if I may shift emphasis, if you don't want to respond to that, I'm fascinated by the targets that a lot of folks on the right are taking. The same thing with the ACORN. I mean, it seemed like under the Clinton administration, there was a whole, planned project to go after the inside of the White House and actually impeach the president at the end of the day. Go trolling through Arkansas and see what dirt they can find. There's been some general talking points that Obama's a Chicago machine, culture of corruption and whatnot, but they've never got anything remotely close to actual goods on that score. I don't think the vast majority of Americans, if they, whatever qualms they might have about the president, don't look at him as a corrupt figure. And therefore, you're seeing the blows that are landing are on outside organizations that don't really have significant ties to the president. And so there's a lot of applauding and back-patting at the end of these things, but I wonder if it's just evidence that they've been pushed so far out of the fringe because they don't have good targets to fire at in the Obama administration.
Well, I don't necessarily know that that's the case because, I don't know to what extent Lila Rose sat around and said, I'd really love to take down the Obama administration, but I can't do it, so instead I'm going to do this. I mean, it seems as though she is sort of motivated as a right-to-life activist, and so it's issue-based rather than looking to, influence the outcome of an election or something like that. That in this case, they're looking for specific policy outcomes. They want no more federal funding for X or for Y. And so I don't necessarily see this as, looking to take little shots around the outside to bring down an Obama machine so much as folks who believe that left-leaning causes funded with taxpayer money are being improper stewards of that, in addition to the fact that the people on the right don't think they should be getting money from the federal government much anyways. But I don't really think this is that if for whatever reason Obama had this vast record of corruption in Chicago, that we wouldn't be seeing this, that attention would be diverted. Instead, I think it's just people with there's different motivations there than what I think might have been motivating folks to dig in Arkansas and find stuff from the Clintons' past.
Fair point. Outside of the never-ending abortion debate, the never-ending healthcare debate also continued with the ruling of Judge Winston in Florida, Reagan appointee judge, where the biggest challenge, I think, is 26 attorney generals challenging the constitutionality of the law, of largely the individual mandate provision. He ruled not just that provision was unconstitutional, but that it was so interconnected to the entirety of the law that the entire law must be overturned. Although it doesn't negate it immediately, it still goes up to the Supreme Court, we presume eventually. Many pot shots on the left taken at the quality of the judge's opinion. Jonathan Cohn at the New Republic, noting that the conspicuously weak arguments, a prime example, so one example is he asserts that the decision not to carry health insurance has zero economic impact,
Then literally a paragraph later, he acknowledges that uncompensated care for the uninsured transferred $43 billion in cost to the rest of society. So there's a lot of things like that that make it seem much more like a sloppy political screed than a thoughtful judicial opinion. And that's one reason why Andrew Cohen at The Atlantic said people are going to spend way too much time talking about this opinion when it's not going to bear on the decision that the Supreme Court makes, particularly Anthony Kennedy. And it pointed to another decision that was a 7-2 ruling by the Supreme Court that essentially accepted a broader interpretation of the Commerce Clause, which is one of the constitutional underpinnings of individual mandate, that Congress has the constitutional right to regulate interstate commerce. And so that ruling was a more hopeful sign for advocates of the law and more relevant to what they might do than what any district judge is going to do.
Well, on the right, you can, I'm sure you can guess, folks are pretty excited about this. In response to the idea that this judge is writing a political screed, my instinct would be that if he was really looking just to use his position as a judge to take a political whack at Obamacare, why wouldn't he have issued an injunction to really shut it down? Instead of saying, I don't like this, but I'm deferring to the next, it's going to go to the next level, so... anyhow, back to the conservative bloggers. You have from the Shark Tank, which was named the blogger of the year for CPAC. It's like a Florida conservative political blog. There, the quote is, while the ruling isn't really a surprise, it cannot be denied that it is yet another major blow in the eyes of the public to the legitimacy of Obamacare. Key provisions of the Obamacare are a clear violation of the Commerce Clause. For a judge to rule otherwise essentially renders the Commerce Clause meaningless. And then later on says, now is the time for a throwdown, if you will, on the constitutional provisions that have been conveniently ignored for decades, particularly over the Commerce Clause. Obamacare's provisions not only violate the Commerce Clause, they violate the plain language of other clauses and constitutional amendments. The original intent of the Commerce Clause was to prevent economic protectionism and anti-competitive business practices by the states, effectively ensuring that the entire United States would be one giant free enterprise zone. Yet look how far we've strayed from the founders' original intent of the Commerce Clause with Obamacare. And then there's actually sort of a really interesting post by Ed Morrissey at Hot Air where he's focusing on Lawrence O'Donnell on MSNBC and a conversation that Lawrence O'Donnell had with Jonathan Turley on The Last Word. The title of the post is Lack of Severability in Obamacare Looked a Colossal Mistake. Or was it? The quote, Larry O'Donnell blames Democrats for rushing the Obamacare bill to a vote and forgetting to insert the severability clause, but Jonathan Turley isn't buying the post-Florida verdict spin from the Capitol Hill. Basically, the suggestion is that Democrats intentionally did not include a severability clause, the thinking being that would deter judges from ruling pieces of it unconstitutional, because then you really are throwing the whole thing out. Basically calls it like a game of Democrats lost this particular round of chicken. And that if this was a deliberate strategy to not include it, the triple dog dare has clearly backfired. Not only has it resulted in 26 states being freed for the moment from the compliance with Obamacare, the sweeping nature of the ruling has made it at least a little more likely that the Supreme Court will accept an expedited review of the case. And as I wrote earlier, that's bad news for Democrats and Obama if it happens. What do you think about that? That folks on the left are upset that there was no severability clause written into the bill, and then some others saying that it was intentionally not written into the bill. Does that ring false to you, or?
I mean, anything is possible. I haven't seen too much discussion on the left on this score. I did notice someone unrelated, Matt Iglesias, criticizing Winston's ruling by saying, since there's no severability clause, he's got to rule the whole thing unconstitutional. And there's parts in that bill that aren't even about health care. There's a whole student loan reform piece in the bill too. Why does that have to be ruled unconstitutional at the same time? But I suspect this kind of academic debate is not terribly relevant at the Supreme Court level, because I believe it was Brennan that said the only rule of the Supreme Court is the rule of five, which is what can you get five people to do. So if five Supreme Court justices want to say, I'm going to overrule part of this and then not the whole thing, or if they five want to say they want to overrule the whole thing, they're just going to do it, and everyone's going to live with it. These kind of technical discussions, I don't think bear too much on the final outcome. I think the final outcome is whatever's in Anthony Kennedy's head, which no one knows what that is just yet.
Well, there's a post by Eric Erickson up at Red State. The title is "How the Stupid Party Gets Its Name," basically bashing the Republican Party for its efforts to allow states to opt out, to fix Obamacare, because by every step that we take to fix the healthcare reform bill, we're making it harder to repeal it. The sort of meat of the quote is that without any obstruction, the GOP went along with Democrats' changes to the onerous 1099 provision. You may say that's a good thing, and you would be right, except that in doing this, instead of keeping the pain in place until Obamacare is repealed, makes the pain less and less. And as the pain becomes less and less because Republicans work with Democrats to fix the bill, it becomes less and less likely that Obamacare will actually get repealed. And then he goes on to mention Anthony Kennedy. Says if states can opt out of the individual mandate, they're talking about the Barrasso and Graham proposal to let states opt out. If states can opt out of the individual mandate, they no longer have grounds to keep up their lawsuit in federal court. Why? Because if they can choose to opt out of the individual mandate, it's no longer a constitutional obstruction to them. Further, proposing this and other changes to Obamacare gives Justice Anthony Kennedy plausible grounds to say, look, Obamacare is severable and it can survive without the individual mandate. So Eric Erickson thinks that fixing it is bad, in part for political reasons, because it makes it tougher to repeal the whole thing.
Well, I find that a strange argument. I mean, there are a couple of things there. One, the 1099 piece is completely unrelated to the actual health care reform in the bill. It's not about health care. It's in the bill, but it's strictly about small business tax compliance, or business tax compliance generally, but small businesses that were the most upset about it because they thought it was going to be an unduly amount of paperwork to comply, and so they got rid of that. I don't think that has any bearing whatsoever on whether health care is going to be, the bill is going to be considered a better bill in the eyes of the public or worse. Now, the question of state waivers is much more interesting, and this is an aspect of the bill that I don't think a lot of people know very well. I mean, already in the bill, there are provisions for state waivers. You can already petition HHS, say, you know what, I got another way to go about health care reform, so long as it expands coverage and reduce costs. And if you can prove that to HHS, they will, or prove that it's at least plausible, they will grant you a waiver, and then you don't have to do the other regulations in the bill, including the individual mandate. Now, the way it's currently in the bill, you can't petition until 2017. The full implementation of this is not until 2014, so there's going to be a 3-year window where people are sort of trying stuff out. And there's a separate bill, not the Graham-Barrasso one that's just Republicans, but there's a bipartisan bill from Democrat Ron Wyden and Republican Scott Brown to move up that date to 2014. And I could see Eric Erickson being mad at that because that is really accepting that the basic premise of health reform will remain, although it should be acknowledged that the whole notion, this whole bill is a federal takeover, is completely negated by the fact that there already are state waiver provisions in the bill. There's some minimum standards that have to be adhered to, but there's already a great deal of state flexibility that's in this thing. The Graham-Barrasso bill, you would think Erickson would love, because that just blows the whole thing up. That's just basically because there's no minimum standards in Graham-Barrasso. That's just saying states can do whatever the hell they want. I mean, that's a conservative pipe dream, that there's essentially no federal regulations or standards whatsoever. So that's not helping Obama's health care reform. That's destroying it.
Well, I think his point is that to fully have it destroyed would be to have the courts just scrap the whole thing, and that by passing that bill, that makes it more difficult for courts to come to the conclusion that they need to scrap the whole thing. I think that's his basic argument.
That's complaining that, why won't you let us use the nuclear bomb and you want to use anthrax instead? I mean, they both kill the whole thing.
Well, and there's some skepticism too out there about the extent to which waivers are going to work fairly. Who's going to get waivers, who's not. There's already concerns like, oh look, unions are getting all these waivers. They're the ones that pushed for this bill, and now they don't have to participate. Interesting. So there's also that concern that like you can have these waiver provisions, but at the end of the day, it's the folks at HHS who are the Obama administration who get to decide if you actually do get to opt out. I don't actually think it does blow up the health reform bill at all. I can
understand the critique of the Brown-Wyden bill, because that does give HHS a lot of authority to say, look, you meet these standards or you don't. But the Graham-Barrasso thing is there's no standards at all.
Well, I will agree that the Brown bill, I guess if it's bipartisan, we'll see if it can make its way through the sandpit that is the Senate. But, like, I think that the idea, I mean, I guess I disagree with I personally would disagree with the premise that we shouldn't try to make it better because making it stay awful will help us get rid of it. I mean, for better, President Obama's still president. He's going to be president for another 2 years. It's possible he'll be president for another 6 years. And so, to the extent that we can make it better, I mean, I don't think that Eric Erickson would like me very much in my opinion, but I do disagree with him on this one. I can see avoiding things that make the bill more solid, like what you mentioned with the Brown bill, but I'm a little more open to the Graham Barrasso. The Graham Barrasso bill.
Well, perhaps we should leave it there. We're going to talk about John Huntsman mania, but we're running a little long with all the Egypt talk.
Yeah, I can summarize it. Why would he do this? That's what the conservative blogosphere is saying, by and large. Why would you do this?
I think much of the left is saying the same. But
so that's basically it.
So my own 2 cents is, John McCain won without the conservative base, so it's not. Don't presume that that's the only path to victory.
Oh, correct. I would firmly agree with you. If you look at the exit polls, it was the person who won the moderate and somewhat conservative block in these Republican primaries who did much better than the person who would win the very conservative. So, I don't think that it's out of the question that somebody who is able to appeal to moderates can and possibly should win the primary. I think that the question is, there's issues, for instance, Ala Pundit at Hot Air points out, Huntsman in 2009 said he thought that the stimulus should have been bigger. That's not going to do very well in a Republican primary. That may be bridge too far.
Duly noted. Always good to talk to you, Kristen.
Good talking to you, too. Have a good week.
We'll see you next week on This Week in Blog.